a veteran who served our country, put his life on the line for our democracy, came back from the Iraqi war, disabled. One day he wrote a check for groceries and it bounced. But because he was too poor for groceries, now the state of Florida was telling him that he would never be able to vote again. And when people think of felony, they think of the worst crimes out there. But the reality is that overwhelming majority of people were getting disenfranchised for crimes that were not like egregious. Or it wasn't a crime that shocked the moral conscience of a society. And so one of the things we've seen was that, for instance, releasing helium-filled balloons in the air. That's a felony in the state of Florida, right? So when you're out there celebrating somebody's graduation or birthday or even a memorial service with white balloons, you release those balloons in the air, that's a felony offense. Driving with a suspended license, catching a lobster whose tail is too short, trespassing on a construction site. So you're trying to get back to work from lunch and you want to take a little shortcut through a construction site, that's a felony offense. Being on a pier after hours or disturbing turtle nesting eggs. There are just so many laws out there that, you know, if you're convicted of it, you lose the right to vote for the rest of your life.
Do you remember back in 2018 when we passed Amendment 4, which gives voting rights back to returning citizens? Well, the fight isn't over. Today we have Desmond Meade to speak to us about what the next steps are. Tell us a bit about the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition.
Sure. The Florida Rights Restoration Coalition is an organization. We go by FRC a lot. And so FRC is an organization that's really made up of people who've been justice impacted, people with felony convictions, and people who have loved ones who've been impacted by the criminal justice system. We're a statewide grassroots organization that focuses on democracy and creating pathways for economic mobility for people that's been justice impacted. Of course, our claim to fame is that we led the efforts in 2018 to pass Amendment 4, which restored voting rights to 1.4 million people with a former felony conviction. And we were recently nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh, wow. That's very impressive. It's something that's definitely hard to do, to get those citizen initiatives statewide.
Oh, yes. You know, Florida, is probably the most difficult state to pass a citizens initiative. But fortunately, we were able to do it. And, Florida needed, I think, at the time, 60% of the votes. We got nearly 65%.
Wow. And just to explain for the public, a citizens initiative is the people going out, getting petition signatures. You have to get enough statewide in order to then get it on the ballot, and the people vote on it. And you said they got 65% of the vote, and then it's added to our state constitution.
Yep, 65% is what we got. And I always tell folks that the Citizens Initiative is, to me, like the second greatest act of democracy, right? Number one being voting, right? That everyone should participate in our democracy by voting. The Citizens Initiative, though, why it's special to me is because when you look at the history of our democracy, we realize that all inherent power starts with individual, and we acquiesce some of that power in order to live together, right? And by doing so, we elect representatives to represent our interests. And the Citizens Initiative is a mechanism that when we feel maybe the representatives are not doing everything that we would like for them to do, then we could take matters in our own hands because the power originated with the people. Yeah. And so the Citizens Initiative, to me, is a very important part of our democracy.
Yes, I agree. It's definitely the basis of democracy, really. And why do you feel it was important that you went ahead and did this and made sure that former incarcerated individuals were able to vote? Why is it important for them to vote?
Well, first of all, at the time,
it's important for everyone to vote, right? That's like that's the basic answer.
But I think it's even more important. And why? Because what we see, especially when you talk about from the context of public safety, right? We've seen studies that show that once an individual is released from prison, right, that there are certain things that must happen if you want to reduce the recidivism rate or the rate in which a person may reoffend. And we found that if you restore a person's rights, to include the right to vote, that they're least likely to commit another offense, right? And so there's a public safety element to it. And in addition to that, there's an economic motivation behind it as well, because you could, our communities can save hundreds of millions of dollars, right, that we would not have to spend to investigate crimes were someone to commit a crime, prosecute them were they to get caught, and then house them if they were to get sentenced. All of those phases, right, I mean, amount of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that taxpayers will have to pay. And so if we're able to reduce the recidivism rate, right, that is a benefit for everyone. And then, of course, I always believe that the more people participate in our democracy, the more vibrant our democracy is. And so those are two major motivating factors. But the last one was the fact that at the time, Florida was one of only 4 states that permanently disenfranchised American citizens. And what I've seen was that I like to talk about Howie. You know, this guy was a Army veteran, and he came back from the Iraqi War, disabled. One day he wrote a check for groceries, and it bounced, and he lost the right to vote. Right here, we have a veteran who served our country, put his life on the line for our democracy, but because he was too poor for groceries, now the state of Florida was telling him that he'll never be able to vote again. And he fought so hard for the opportunity to get his rights restored. It took him 30 years. 30 years. And, you know, when you looked at that, like that slim piece of hope that he had, right, it was all dependent on the governor and his clemency board, right, which was the 4 major officers that are elected statewide, right? So it's the governor, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Chief Financial Officer, and the Attorney General, right? And that's the only way that anyone could ever get any kind of relief. And that was kind of, I don't know, it was kind of scary for me, right? Because I'm thinking, wait a minute, you know, voting is the most telling form of citizenship. And to think that 4 politicians had that much power to determine which American citizen get to vote and which don't get to vote, that didn't feel right. And it didn't matter what political party it was. No politician, period, should have that much power, because it always leaves the room for partisan politics to play a role in the decision-making process, especially when it's an arbitrary process. And so, you know, I figured it was too much power for any politician to have, and that type of power deserves to be in the hands of the people, a la the Citizens Initiative.
How does someone lose their rights to vote?
Well,
because you mentioned, you know, just a check bouncing. That's scary, that you could lose the right to vote just for something like that.
Yeah, you know, well, let me tell you the history of it. You know, as far as felon disenfranchisement in this country, we've seen it used as a tool or a mechanism when the slaves were freed. And that was a way to strip them of their newfound political capital. And so you were seeing early on that people were losing their rights to vote for crimes that a slave would most likely commit, like vagrancy, not having a job, loitering, you know, things of that nature. Stealing a chicken, like in one state, you would actually lose the right to vote for stealing a chicken, but you wouldn't lose the right to vote for killing someone, right? And so as the courts got involved and said, wait a minute, this is a little bit too egregious, you know, the states finally landed on, some states landed on that if you commit a felony offense, which is a crime that can be punishable by a year or more, if you commit a felony offense, you lose the right to vote. In Florida, for the rest of your life. Now, when people think of felony, they think of the worst crimes out there. But the reality is that overwhelming majority of people were getting disenfranchised for crimes that were not like egregious. Or it wasn't a crime that shocked the moral conscience of a society. And so one of the things we've seen was that, for instance, releasing helium-filled balloons in the air. That's a felony in the state of Florida, right? So when you're out there celebrating somebody's graduation or birthday or even a memorial service with white balloons, you release those balloons in the air. That's a felony offense. And if convicted, you lose your right for the rest of your life. Driving with a suspended
So a
license.
5-year-old who accidentally loses his balloon.
In Florida,
loses his right to
that
vote.
5-year-old would get arrested. You know, in Florida, anything can happen, right? We see kids getting arrested for anything nowadays. And so, you know, driving with a suspended license, catching a lobster whose tail is too short, trespassing on the construction site. So you're trying to get back to work from lunch and you want to take a little shortcut through a construction site, that's a felony offense. Being on a pier after hours or disturbing turtle nesting eggs. There are just so many laws out there that, you know, if you're convicted of it, you lose the right to vote for the rest of your life.
Wow. Okay, I didn't know a lot of those things. What are the reasons that people have mentioned against giving the rights back? What's the controversy?
No, that's a great question. There's really no controversy, right? There's the politics that's involved in it, but there's really no controversy. And I have great evidence of that, right? In November 2018, over 5.1 million people, 65% of the voters that came to the polls voted yes on Amendment 4. Over 1 million people who voted yes were Republicans. We know that 40% of the people who voted for Governor DeSantis voted for Amendment 4. And we show the world that this was an issue that no matter where you're from or what your political preference was, that it had some type of meaning to you, that everyone, you know, a lot of folks had someone, a loved one, who've made mistakes in their life. And, you know, once you've paid your debt to society, once you served your time, that you should be able to move on with your life. And people believe in second chances. This is a country of second chance. There is no legitimate argument that's ever been made about why a person should not be given the right to vote once they serve their time, right? At the end of the day, you know, it just comes down to pure politics, right? And if you take the politics out of it, it's common sense. I mean, but unfortunately, we live in a society that politicizes everything. I mean, we even politicize whether or not a child should have safe drinking water. What is that? What is there to politicize? This is just something that's pure, like dealing with human rights and human dignity. And so I think Amendment 4 showed that this particular issue is something that would resonate with anyone, no matter what their race, no matter what their political preference is.
So whenever there's controversy where there shouldn't be controversy, they always say follow the money. Is there any money to be made in preventing former felons from voting?
Well,
what is the proper term?
Returning citizens.
Returning citizens.
And that's the term we use because here's the whole deal. What we do know is this, right? That words are used as weapons, right? And words are used to dehumanize people and also to desensitize us as to their humanity, right? And so when you use convict, felon, and those are, words that does that. You know, one of the greatest examples that I use is how one word could change a person, right? When they put illegal in front of immigrant, that totally changes how we view immigrants in this country and how we empathize with them and how do we, how we see them as just human beings just like us, right? And so we tend to try to use positive words or affirming words, right? Because at the end of the day, guess what? Anyone who's made a mistake is still someone's father, mother, sister, brother, right? And they're first and foremost a human being. And so we use that word. But as to your question, I want to make sure I get the answer right. Tell me the question again.
The money.
The money.
Yeah.
All right. And where's the connection there? Well, let me tell you. Part of it is, especially I know in the earlier days when we were trying to restore rights, and we made a very compelling argument, right? Society as a whole understand one thing, right? They want to be safe. Everybody want to be safe, right? And so it is in everyone's best interest that if there's someone who was convicted of an offense, served their time, and are reentering back into society, which we know 95% of the people who are incarcerated will reenter back into our communities. It's in everybody's best interest that when they reenter, that they are successful, so they won't commit another offense. And so when we were making arguments saying, listen, research, indisputable research has been very clear. If people are able to get jobs, housing, if they're able to regain their dignity, if they're able to participate in democracy, then you will reduce recidivism. They will not commit another offense. Everybody wins when that happens. Even when you look at the law enforcement community, they will tell you the best way to fight crime is to prevent it from happening in the first place, right? It saves dollars and it saves lives. And so when you're talking about engaging in practices that allow a person to successfully reintegrate, it's a win-win situation. But it's hard to get some politicians to buy into that. And part of the reason is when you follow the money, and we've seen this back in 2011, 2012, was that you've seen private prisons were being great contributors to campaigns of certain politicians. And private prisons, it's not in their best interest for people like me to be successfully reintegrated back into the community. They make their money out of filling beds. And it's a profit-driven industry. And so they're more likely to support environments or situations that would cause me to commit another offense so I could be one of their clients and they can get paid.
Yeah. Where are we now with the initiative? I know it was passed in the ballot. We got that placed into law, but other things have happened since then.
Yes. Immediately after we passed Amendment 4, Florida legislature enacted a law that says that before a person could exercise the right to vote, they would have to pay all of their outstanding legal financial obligations. And of course, there was lawsuits that was filed. But at the end of the day, where we are right now is that people do have to pay if they have outstanding restitution, if they have court costs or fees that are associated with their conviction, then those would have to be satisfied or waived. They could be paid off or waived before they're able to register to vote. In 2020, we raised over $30 million and went throughout the state of Florida helping people pay off their fines and fees because, listen, let me tell you, right? The court system have no expectations of collecting more than 10% of fines and fees assessed by the courts. They have no expectation of that. They only collect over all of these years, only 10% of all the money that have been assessed. And a lot of these people who are being assessed these fines and fees were too poor to pay that. They're struggling to make ends meet. And people are forced between paying a fine or fee or putting food on their table or paying rent or mortgage, right? And now when you want to add in the fact that, hey, wait a minute, if you want to vote, then now you've got to choose between paying fines and fees, putting food on your table, voting, whatever. And, I really believe that, when you talk about democracy, no one should have to pay to be able to participate in democracy. Access to the ballot box should be free and unencumbered. But unfortunately, there's a requirement out there now that's saying that people have to pay these fines and fees. So we've been paying them, but then now we're moving into the other area to where we're trying to work with courts and the legal system to help get these fines and fees waived or converted to community service hours, or maybe a variation of both. And we're going in various jurisdictions throughout the state of Florida and trying to sign people up and get them through the courts.
So you fought this hard fight and thought you won, and then your work wasn't over.
It was not over. And I did not expect this big of a fight, but some of it, I get a little disheartening because I think that, felon disenfranchisement was the issue that was in the state of Florida for about 150 years. And, I tell folks that, man, it's like politicians walking past a homeless family for 150 years and not lifting a finger to help. And one day the citizens of the community said, you know what, we're going to do something about it. And they build the family a brand new home. As soon as they finish building the home, here comes the politician trying to dictate how the home is furnished, right? That was what we faced with Amendment 4, right? We brought people together with Amendment 4, and I tell folks every day that love won the day, right? That we had people from all walks of life, and they weren't driven by hatred or fear, but rather they were driven by love, forgiveness, and redemption. And we showed something beautiful, that how we can move major policy issues, right, without having to attack each other or tear each other down, right? That we can do it driven by love. And the minute we were successful, the politicians come, and now it became all political, right? And, it made it a little messy. But in spite of it all, one of the things that we always say is that we're going to continue to place people over politics. And where other people see obstacles, we see opportunities. And so in spite of the fact that there is a legal financial obligation requirement that have to be met, man, we're seeing opportunities to go out in the community and engage folks and get people excited about participating in our democracy. We're seeing opportunities to discover folks who don't have outstanding fines and fees, but didn't know it, and they thought that they'll never be a part of democracy. But man, we've got people that have literally been dying to be able to get to feel what it felt like to be able to cast a ballot, to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And that is invigorating, it's encouraging, and we're going to continue moving forward.
And how can the public help with these efforts? I know it sounds like there's a lot that needs to be done. What can people do?
Well, I mean, there's so much that the public can do. One of the things is they can go to our website at www.floridarrc.com, and there are many ways to volunteer. Especially if people are in the legal profession, we need as many volunteers as possible, whether they're paralegals or attorneys, right, to help research cases. Because one of the things with Florida legislature mandated that you pay off fines and fees before you're able to vote, but they didn't have a centralized database in order to tell someone what they owe. So you're telling someone, hey, you better pay your fines before you vote, but we can't tell you how much you owe. It was a really weird situation. And so what we've been doing is getting people volunteer pro bono hours to help do the research and make the determination what people owe, and then help put together motions that we can file in the courts to get those fines and fees waived or converted to community service hours. And so we definitely need volunteers there. And then people can also donate. We have a fines and fees fund that they could donate to. We also have like a bail fund, legal defense fund, for people who are being targeted by, our state for voting and stuff like that. And so there's a lot that people can do to volunteer.
And what inspired you to get started in all this?
Wow. I'm a returning citizen myself. I lost the right to vote long ago. I don't know if it was just me wanting to get my right to vote. I don't think that was the main motivation. I think my main motivation was seeing other people, just the struggles. How people make a mistake, and because of that mistake, they have collateral consequences. There are like over 400 and something collateral consequences that people face once they've been arrested, even just arrested, right? And you're denied access to jobs, housing, education, right? And just hearing the stories from people across the state of Florida, I can't, go on a school trip with my kids because I got in a bar fight 10 years ago, or, I can't vote, I can't get a license, occupation license, and things of that nature. And then, of course, not being able to vote. And so, I think my personal journey as a person who was formerly homeless, addicted to drugs, in and out of jail and prison, at one point getting ready to end my life, but not doing it and overcoming that to eventually obtaining a law degree. It was a much bigger thing at play, right? There's a saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. I believe that also applies to our society, to this state, that we can only be as strong as people in our communities that's been most weakened by systems of oppression and racism, or even that narrative that says that some lives are just not as valuable as others. When you think about a chain, no matter how strong the other links are, right, that chain can only bear as much weight as the weakest link can handle. And if we want the chain to hold more weight, to bear more weight, then we must focus on the weakest link and strengthen it. And so when we look at people who've been impacted by the justice system, we are a group of people that have been most weakened. And so being able to engage in some type of advocacy to strengthen, our lives, to strengthen us as individuals, that we're not our worst mistake, that we can be great contributors to society. Being able to lift people like me up, I think lifts everyone up. If I'm able to get a job, if I'm able to pay my fair share of taxes, if I'm able to get an education, a profession, if I'm able to vote, right? All of those things are not only just good for me, but they're good for my family, they're good for my community, they're good for this state and this country.
Well, thank you so much for being here. You're definitely inspiration, and what you've accomplished is just amazing.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you're enjoying this show, please subscribe to our channel and follow our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter accounts.